Hi there, and welcome to Ku English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. The Geometry of Chaos. The Life Story of Benoit Mandelbrot. Chapter 1. A Boy from Warsaw. In the cold winter of 1924, in the city of Warsaw, Poland, a child was born who would one day change how we see the world. His name was Benoit Mandelbrot. He would become known for seeing shapes and patterns where others saw only confusion. But before he became a famous mathematician, he was just a boy, curious, quiet, and very different from the children around him. Benoit came from a Jewish family. His father, Henry Mandelbrot, was a merchant. His mother, Lucia, had studied medicine, which was not common for women at that time. Education was very important in the Mandelbrot family. They believed that knowledge could protect people, guide them, and help them live a better life. But Benoit's childhood was not always peaceful. In the 1920s and 30s, Poland was not a safe place for Jews. Anti-Semitism, hatred toward Jewish people was growing. His parents worried about the future. They had already seen how dangerous Europe could become, and soon dark clouds would cover the continent. Even before he learned to read, Benoit loved looking at pictures. He could spend hours staring at maps, patterns in nature, or old books with strange drawings. He once said that his way of thinking was geometric. While other children used words, he thought in shapes. For example, he could look at a coastline and imagine how its rough edge could be described using mathematics. But he didn't know how yet. Luckily, there was someone in his life who saw his potential. His uncle Sholem Mandelbrot. Sholem was a respected mathematician in France. He was also one of the few family members who had a strong position in the academic world. Sholem often visited the family or sent letters full of ideas and encouragement. He noticed that Benoit had a special mind, and he wanted to help shape it. Benoit's early schooling was not easy. He moved from one school to another. Sometimes he didn't do well on tests. Sometimes he didn't fit in. Teachers thought he was lazy or strange. But Benoit was not lazy. He was just thinking in a different way. While others followed rules, he asked questions. While others memorized answers, he tried to see the big picture. His mind worked in images, in chaos, in connections. In his home, Benoit heard several languages. His parents spoke Polish, French, and Yiddish. This mix of languages made him feel comfortable with complexity. He learned that things didn't have to be simple to be beautiful. Later in life, this idea would become central to his greatest discoveries. The Mandelbrots were not wealthy, but they were rich in ideas. Books filled their home. Conversations at the dinner table were serious and thoughtful. Benoit's mother often reminded him to work hard and stay curious. His father, a practical man, taught him how to stay strong in difficult times. This balance between imagination and survival would become part of who he was. When Benoit was about 11 years old, his family made a big decision. The situation in Poland was becoming too dangerous for Jews. The family decided to move to France, where his uncle Sholem lived. This move would change Benoit's life forever. He would lose many things: his home, his friends, the streets of Warsaw he once knew. But he would gain a new world, a place where he could explore ideas more freely. France was not easy at first. Benoit had to learn new customs, a new school system, and a new way of life. But he found comfort in one thing: ideas. In books and in shapes, he could still feel at home. Slowly, he began to see how his strange way of thinking could become something useful, maybe even something powerful. Looking back, many people see Benoit Mandelbrot as a genius, but at this early stage, he was just a boy trying to understand the world in his own way. His childhood, full of fear and change, also gave him a gift: the ability to see beyond the obvious. The streets of Warsaw, the voices of his family, the letters from his uncle, and the shapes in his mind all stayed with him. They became the foundation for the man he would become. The man who would one day teach the world that chaos is not the opposite of order, but a deeper kind of order waiting to be seen. Chapter 2. Escaping Shadows of War. When Benoit Mandelbrot arrived in France with his family, the world was already changing fast. It was the late 1930s. Europe was on the edge of a terrible war. Though he had escaped from the growing danger in Poland, the shadows of violence were already reaching into France. At first, life in France felt strange. Benoit was only a boy, but he understood that this move was not a holiday. It was a rescue. His family left behind friends, relatives, and everything familiar. They came to a place where the language, the customs, and even the food felt different. Though Benoit had heard French spoken at home, speaking it daily in public was a challenge. The Mandelbrots settled in Paris, where Uncle Sholem helped them adjust. Sholem was now a respected figure in French academic circles. His connection to the world of mathematics became a quiet safety net for Benoit. Sholem had no children of his own, and he saw Benoit as more than a nephew. He saw him as a student, perhaps even a future mathematician. Still, things were not easy. The air in Europe was tense. Nazi Germany had become more aggressive, and many Jews in France feared what was coming. The Mandelbrats tried to live normally, but they were always aware of how quickly things could change. At school, Benoit remained different. He didn't enjoy the way lessons were taught. He found the subjects too narrow, the tests too predictable. He was more interested in solving puzzles, looking at maps, and reading old science books than following standard textbooks. Teachers were not always patient with his unusual interests. Some thought he wasn't serious, others thought he was too dreamy, but Benoit was simply thinking in his own way. One of the few things that gave him joy was geometry. He loved shapes, not just simple ones like circles and triangles, but complicated forms that twisted and turned. He noticed patterns in rivers, clouds, tree branches, and even in the cracks on the walls. While most people looked at such things without much thought, Benoit asked, why do they look like that? Is there a rule behind their form? When World War II finally broke out, Benoit's family had to move again. The German army began invading parts of France, and Paris was no longer safe. Like many families, the Mandelbrats fled south. They ended up in Toul, a small town in the countryside. Life there was harder, but it was safer for a time. In Toul, there were fewer resources. Books were not easy to find. Schools were closed or disorganized. But even without formal lessons, Benoit kept learning. He explored the countryside, stared at the natural world, and kept asking questions. His brain was like a machine that never stopped turning. He didn't need a classroom to think. During these years, Benoit also experienced real fear. He had to hide his identity. Being Jewish in Nazi-occupied France was dangerous. His family used false names and stayed away from cities. Sometimes, they were close to being discovered. These moments left deep marks on Benoit. He learned how to survive, how to adapt, and how to stay mentally sharp even when everything around him felt uncertain. His uncle Sholem never stopped encouraging him. Even when they were apart, Sholem sent him ideas to think about. He wrote letters filled with problems, theories, and little pieces of wisdom. In a time when life was uncertain, mathematics became something solid. Patterns, numbers, and logic gave Benoit comfort. They did not lie. They did not disappear. They waited to be understood. One day, Benoit remembered a moment when he was walking along a stream in the countryside. He looked at the curves of the water's edge and thought, this is not a straight line. But is it random? Or does it have a kind of rule I just don't know yet? That simple thought stayed in his mind. It would later become a key to his life's work. By the time the war ended, Benoit was a young man. He had lived through hunger, fear, and many changes. He had lost friends and seen people disappear. But he had also gained something, a deep way of looking at the world, not just with his eyes, but with his imagination. He had learned that nature was full of questions, and unlike most people, he was not afraid of difficult questions. In fact, he welcomed them. To him, complexity was beautiful, and soon he would begin his journey to show the world that beauty. But before he could change science, Benoit needed to find a place where he could study freely, a place where he could follow his unusual ideas without being forced into narrow paths. That place would not be easy to find. Still, Benoit had already learned an important lesson. You don't need to fit in to succeed. You just need to keep thinking. Chapter 3. A Mind That Sees Shapes. While other students learned to repeat facts, Benoit Mandelbrot began to see the world differently. He had survived a war, moved through many towns, and lived with the constant fear of being discovered. But his mind had not been defeated. In fact, it had grown sharper. Now, with the war finally over, Mandelbrot's journey into formal education could begin. In 1944, France was slowly rebuilding itself. Schools opened again, and students returned to the classroom. Mandelbrot was older than most of his classmates, but that did not matter. What made him truly different was not his age, it was how he thought. His mind worked in pictures. Mandelbrot did not enjoy algebra in the way others did. Equations, long formulas, and standard procedures bored him. Instead, he thought in shapes, forms, and visual patterns. To him, a good math problem was not something to solve step by step. It was a puzzle to be seen, turned, and explored from different sides. He often imagined shapes that did not exist in any textbook, spirals that repeated forever, borders that never ended, coastlines with endless curves. Even simple lines, when looked at closely, seemed to contain secrets. Mandelbrot began to wonder, what if the world itself is made up of irregular shapes? What if those shapes follow hidden rules? But his way of thinking sometimes made school difficult. Teachers expected students to follow instructions. They wanted clear answers. Benoit, however, often gave unexpected responses. He would solve problems in ways that confused his teachers. Some called him brilliant. Others thought he was just strange. Fortunately, Mandelbrot's uncle Sholem remained an important guide. He saw Benoit's talent and continued to support him with advice and academic connections. With Sholem's help, Benoit entered the prestigious Lycée Rollin, and then prepared for France's most difficult higher education path, the entrance exams to top engineering and science schools. At first, Benoit failed one of the major exams. He was disappointed, but not defeated. He tried again and eventually entered the École Polytechnique in 1945, one of France's most respected institutions for science and mathematics. The École Polytechnique was not easy. The students were the best in the country. The program was strict, and the expectations were high. But for the first time, Benoit was in a place where thinking differently was not only accepted, it was sometimes rewarded. Still, he did not fit the usual mold. While other students focused on pure mathematics or engineering, Benoit continued to explore patterns and shapes in nature. He was especially fascinated by irregular things. Mountains, clouds, rivers, coastlines. They didn't follow simple rules, but they didn't seem random either. One day, Benoit read a paper by the mathematician Gaston Julia, who had worked on complex functions and shapes that repeated themselves. These were not simple geometries. They were strange and beautiful figures that seemed to grow forever. Julia's ideas lit a spark in Mandelbrot's mind. Even though Julia's work had been forgotten by many, Mandelbrot saw something powerful in it. He realized that mathematics didn't have to stay in the neat, clean world of perfect triangles and circles. It could describe the messy beauty of real life. This idea became the seed of what would later be known as fractal geometry. But at that time, Mandelbrot didn't have a name for it. He only had questions and the courage to keep following them. After finishing at École Polytechnique, Benoit studied at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, in the United States for a short period, where he improved his understanding of engineering and physics. He then returned to France and earned his doctoral degree in mathematical sciences. Through all this, one thing stayed the same. Mandelbrot refused to be limited by just one subject. He moved between physics, mathematics, engineering, and even economics. If a problem interested him, he studied it. He didn't care which department it belonged to. This way of thinking sometimes made it hard for him to find steady work. Many professors stayed in one field their entire careers. Mandelbrot moved freely across disciplines, but to him, it wasn't disorder, it was curiosity. He would later say, "My life seemed to be a series of accidents. but they were accidents that made sense. During this time, Mandelbrot also developed a habit that stayed with him forever. He looked at problems visually before he approached them logically. If he could see a pattern, he could understand the problem better. Sometimes, he even solved questions by drawing them out. His notebooks were filled not just with numbers and equations, but with strange, fascinating pictures, spirals, jagged lines, repeating curves. These drawings were not just doodles, they were early steps toward a new way of thinking in mathematics. To most people, a tree is just a tree. To Benoit Mandelbrot, a tree is a system. Its branches split in ways that repeat. Its leaves spread in patterns. Its form follows rules we can't always see, but that exist just the same. In these early years of education, Mandelbrot was building a new kind of vision, not only for himself, but eventually for the entire world of science. And soon, his unusual vision would take him across the ocean to a country where free thinking and innovation were highly valued. There, his ideas would begin to find the space they needed to grow. Chapter 4. Crossing Oceans, Crossing Disciplines. In 1958, Benoit Mandelbrot crossed the Atlantic Ocean once again. This time, it wasn't as a refugee or a student. It was as a curious thinker searching for a place where he could explore ideas freely. Ideas too unusual for many of the academic institutions in Europe. His destination, the United States of America. America was entering a new era. It was a time of great scientific discovery and rapid technological change. The Cold War had pushed governments to invest heavily in science. Computers were beginning to appear, and space exploration was on the horizon. For someone like Mandelbrot, who refused to stay inside academic boxes, it was the perfect environment. He joined the research staff at IBM's Thomas J. Watson Research Center in Yorktown Heights, New York. Unlike most universities, IBM gave Mandelbrot freedom. There were no strict departments, no rigid expectations. Researchers were encouraged to follow their interests, especially if those interests could eventually support computing or technology. At IBM, Mandelbrot found what he had been missing for years, a space where he could move between disciplines without resistance. He could study math one day, economics the next, and physics the day after that. More importantly, he had access to computers, new machines that could calculate and draw what the human hand could not. This was a turning point. While at IBM, Mandelbrot began to explore something that had puzzled economists for a long time: the wild and unpredictable movements of financial markets. Stocks, currencies, and prices didn't behave the way traditional models predicted. Prices sometimes jumped suddenly, patterns repeated in odd ways. Traditional mathematics couldn't explain it, but Mandelbrot had an idea. He remembered something from his earlier studies, the work of French mathematician Louis Bourchelier, who had tried to model stock prices. And he thought about the shapes he had always been fascinated by: jagged, uneven, seemingly random shapes that still showed signs of repeating patterns. He began to wonder, what if the same kinds of rules that govern irregular shapes in nature, like coastlines or clouds, also govern the behavior of financial markets? This idea led him to create mathematical models that broke from tradition. Instead of using smooth, predictable curves, Mandelbrot used irregular, self-similar structures. These were shapes that repeated themselves at different scales. A small piece looked similar to a larger piece. These models did a better job of explaining real-world price movements than classical models. It was controversial. Economists didn't like the idea. They believed in clean, average-based models that were easier to work with. But Mandelbrot argued that real-world data was messy, and that it was time for mathematics to reflect that reality. Meanwhile, the strange shapes Mandelbrot was drawing, on paper and now on computer screens, began to take on more meaning. Using computers at IBM, he was able to generate images of complex structures that would have been impossible to draw by hand. One of these shapes, based on work by mathematicians Pierre Fatou and Gaston Julia, became the foundation of a new type of geometry. The images were beautiful and strange. They showed endless detail, no matter how much you zoomed in. There were spirals, patterns, and forms that echoed nature itself. Mountains, coastlines, clouds, trees, Mandelbrot saw connections everywhere. This was the birth of fractal geometry. The word fractal came from the Latin fractus, meaning broken or irregular. But to Mandelbrot, these shapes were not just broken, they were full of meaning. They described the world as it truly was, rough, complex, and wonderfully detailed. As he once said, clouds are not spheres, mountains are not cones, coastlines are not circles, and bark is not smooth, nor does lightning travel in a straight line. Fractal geometry offered a way to describe these things mathematically. It challenged the belief that math had to be simple to be useful. Mandelbrot believed that beauty and complexity could live together with logic and structure. But outside IBM, Mandelbrot still struggled to find acceptance. His work didn't fit neatly into one field. It wasn't just mathematics. It wasn't just physics. It wasn't just economics. It was all of them and something more. In this chapter of his life, Mandelbrot had become a traveler between worlds. He had crossed oceans and disciplines, refusing to stay in one place. He trusted that truth could be found in the overlaps, in the patterns that connect fields and ideas. Still, while IBM gave him space and tools, recognition was slow to come. Many still viewed his work as too strange, too visual, too unlike real math. But Benoit Mandelbrot was used to being the outsider. He continued to draw, to calculate, and to explore the beauty hidden in complexity. And soon, the world would begin to see what he had seen all along. Copyright notice. Cool English Channel. All rights reserved. This video and its content are protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, redistribution, re-uploading, or modification of this content is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. Respect the creator. Do not steal. Chapter 5. The Shapes of Nature. Clouds are not spheres. Mountains are not cones. Mandelbrot had once declared, nor is lightning straight. To him, this was not just poetic. It was a challenge to the mathematical world, a world that, for centuries, had preferred smooth lines, perfect circles, and clean equations. But nature was not smooth. Nature was wild, and Mandelbrot wanted to describe it honestly. At IBM, he now had the tools to go deeper. With computer graphics still in their early stages, he used what power he had to generate images of shapes based on mathematical formulas. What emerged were fractal patterns, complex forms that repeated themselves at different scales. These shapes were not just beautiful, they were everywhere in nature. He saw them in coastlines that twisted and turned with no regular shape, yet showed a kind of hidden order. He saw them in mountain ranges, in the branches of trees, in rivers that split into smaller streams. Even in the pattern of blood vessels or the growth of ferns, there it was again, self-similarity. This quality of repeating patterns on different scales became a key idea. In traditional geometry, a square is always a square, and the triangle stays the same no matter how much you zoom in. But in fractal geometry, when you zoom into part of a shape, it often looks like the whole. The parts echo the pattern of the whole structure. This concept fascinated Mandelbrot, especially because it wasn't just a visual idea, it had mathematical depth. To explain nature's roughness, Mandelbrot used a mathematical tool called a power law. In systems ruled by power laws, small events happen often, and large events happen rarely, but they follow a predictable ratio. This could describe not just the size of earthquakes or the flow of rivers, but even stock market crashes. His work challenged the traditional view that natural events were random and unconnected. Instead, Mandelbrot believed that complexity could have order if you knew where to look. The more he studied, the more convinced he became that fractals were not just interesting curiosities. They were the geometry of reality. But getting others to see it was another matter. In the early 1970s, he began sharing his findings with other scientists. Some were fascinated, especially those working in fields where traditional models had failed. Meteorologists saw value in his approach to modeling clouds and storms. Biologists noticed that the patterns in tree branches and blood vessels matched what Mandelbrot described. Even artists and architects became interested. Still, many mathematicians remained doubtful. His work was too visual. It lacked the formal proofs that some insisted on, and it crossed to many fields: math, physics, finance, biology. For some, that made it seem unfocused. But Mandelbrot did not back down. He continued to produce images, wild, intricate shapes generated by computer algorithms. He didn't just publish in math journals. He gave talks at conferences across many disciplines. His images were not just numbers. They were stories. Stories that spoke to scientists and non-scientists alike. Then, in 1975, he gave these shapes a name: fractals. The name itself was a breakthrough. It gave scientists a way to talk about something they had seen but hadn't been able to define. With a single word, Mandelbrot had created a new language for understanding complexity. As he wrote and spoke more about fractals, he began to draw connections between them and human-made systems too. City structures, traffic flows, internet networks all showed patterns that could be described using fractals. Mandelbrot was now building a bridge not only between disciplines, but between math and the real world. His work was helping people see that math didn't have to be limited to idealized shapes like triangles and circles. It could describe the irregular, rough, and unpredictable shapes that fill our everyday lives. In 1982, Mandelbrot published his most famous book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature. It was unlike any math book before it. It was filled with images, diagrams, and plain language explanations. He wanted it to be read not just by mathematicians, but by anyone curious about how the world works. The book quickly gained attention. For the first time, people could see what Mandelbrot had been talking about. The images were stunning: spirals, flowers, stars, shapes that repeated into infinity. People could see the connection between math and nature with their own eyes. And suddenly, Benoit Mandelbrot wasn't just a quiet researcher at IBM. He was becoming a public figure, a mathematician who spoke not just with equations, but with beauty. Still, despite this growing recognition, he never saw himself as a man of one field. He remained a wanderer, a thinker, who belonged to no single category. In a world that asked people to specialize, Mandelbrot continued to connect. He believed that the real magic of science happened at the edges, where one field met another, and unexpected patterns emerged. And through it all, he held on to a simple but powerful idea that the world's complexity was not something to fear, but something to embrace, and that, perhaps, we could understand it after all. Chapter 6. A New Way of Seeing. By the early 1980s, Benoit Mandelbrot had done something few mathematicians ever do. He had changed the way people looked at the world. With the release of The Fractal Geometry of Nature in 1982, the public was introduced to shapes they had never seen before, yet somehow recognized. Readers were stunned by the beauty and depth of fractals. These images were not just mathematical graphs. They were like landscapes, galaxies, and seashells all at once. Many were struck by a strange feeling. This was mathematics, but it felt alive. For Mandelbrot, the excitement around fractals was not just about beauty, it was about truth. He believed that the world had long been misunderstood. Classical geometry focused on perfect shapes and smooth curves, was useful for simple objects like a ball or a building, but the real world was not smooth. Nature was messy, detailed, and rough. Traditional geometry had failed to describe trees, coastlines, clouds, or lightning, but fractal geometry could. More importantly, fractals could describe these complex shapes with simplicity. A single mathematical rule, repeated over and over, could produce results that looked like nature itself. This idea was called self-similarity. A small part of a fractal looked like the whole. This self-similarity was everywhere. In snowflakes, in broccoli, in coral reefs. It was as if nature had been using fractal rules all along, but no one had noticed until Mandelbrot came along. Soon, fractals began appearing in classrooms, art galleries, and even on TV. Some people saw them as art, others as science. Many saw them as both. At universities, more and more students wanted to study this new geometry. Fields that had once been far apart, like biology, Economics and meteorology began to find common ground in fractal theory. Mandelbrot had opened a new door in mathematics. On the other side were researchers ready to explore. But Mandelbrot's journey was not without resistance. Some mathematicians still viewed his work as too visual, too informal, or too unusual. They wanted more proofs, more formulas, more structure. But Mandelbrot believed deeply that images were just as important as equations. Seeing is understanding, he often said. He didn't see himself as replacing traditional mathematics. Instead, he was completing it. He wanted to give people a new set of tools, a new lens to look at things they had always found too complex. At the same time, Mandelbrot was also exploring something that surprised many, the stock market. To most, finance and mathematics seemed like separate worlds. But Mandelbrot believed that financial markets were perfect examples of fractal behavior. Prices jumped in sudden bursts. Patterns repeated on different timescales. Sharp ups and downs were not rare accidents, they were part of the system. This went against the common belief that markets followed smooth, predictable trends. Mandelbrot argued that the market had been misunderstood, much like coastlines and clouds. He proposed that price movements followed power laws and displayed heavy tails, meaning that extreme changes happened more often than people thought. This was a bold claim. In a world where financial models were based on the idea of normal distribution and stability, Mandelbrot was saying, no, the system is wild, and we need a better map. His ideas didn't always gain acceptance in finance, but they planted seeds. Years later, during financial crises, many would return to Mandelbrot's warnings. They would realize that the old models had missed the deep patterns hiding in the data. Through all of this, Mandelbrot remained a unique figure. He didn't fully belong in any academic group. He was too visual for traditional mathematicians, too mathematical for economists, and too unpredictable for universities. But that was his strength. He followed his own curiosity. He moved across fields. He cared more about the big picture than about fitting in. And this freedom allowed him to see things others missed. By the mid-1980s, he had become a quiet celebrity. People who had never cared about mathematics were now fascinated by fractals. Mandelbrot appeared in documentaries. His work inspired musicians, artists, computer scientists, and even video game designers. In a way, Mandelbrot had done more than discover fractals. He had helped people see beauty in complexity. He had shown that mathematics could describe not just clean, artificial shapes, but the wild, chaotic forms of real life. And perhaps most importantly, he had reminded the world that new ideas often come from the edges, from those who dare to wander between disciplines, to ask strange questions, and to look at old problems with new eyes. For Benoit Mandelbrot, the journey of discovery was not just about numbers. It was about learning to see the world again, as if for the first time. Chapter 7. Into the Unknown, Exploring Chaos and Order. By the late 1980s, Benoit Mandelbrot was no longer a quiet figure in the corner of science. He was now a thinker whose ideas had reached artists, physicists, economists, and even children playing with computers. Fractals were appearing on t-shirts, book covers, and television screens. But for Mandelbrot, this was not a time to rest. He was still deeply engaged in exploring the unknown edge between chaos and order. This chapter of his life brought him into contact with an emerging new field, chaos theory. Chaos theory studied systems that seemed unpredictable, yet followed strict rules. A famous example was the weather. Small changes in the starting conditions, like the flap of a butterfly's wings, could lead to vastly different outcomes. This became known as the butterfly effect. Scientists realized that many real-life systems behaved in this way, sensitive, complex, and impossible to predict in detail, yet full of hidden patterns. Mandelbrot's fractals were a perfect match for this new science. Fractals weren't just about shapes, they were also about how complex systems behaved over time. Just as a coastline had detail no matter how closely you looked, chaotic systems had structure no matter how long you observed. In fact, some of the first images from chaos theory looked like Mandelbrot's fractals. This confirmed something he had always believed. Nature used repetition, feedback, and scaling to build complexity. Simple rules, applied over and over, could create results that looked random, but weren't. Mandelbrot's earlier work, once considered strange and even unnecessary, suddenly made sense in this new context. One of the most powerful examples of his ideas was the Mandelbrot set, a mathematical object he had been developing for years. By now, it had become iconic. When viewed on a computer screen, it revealed a black shape surrounded by colorful, endlessly detailed edges. No matter how far you zoomed in, new forms kept appearing, each one beautiful, familiar, and strange at the same time. What made the Mandelbrot set so exciting was that it came from an extremely simple formula, yet it produced infinite complexity. This idea that infinity could come from simplicity was both mathematical and philosophical. For many, it felt almost spiritual. The boundary of the Mandelbrot set was not just a line, it was a universe of patterns, symmetry, and surprise. Even more remarkably, the Mandelbrot set brought people into contact with mathematics in a visual and emotional way. Students who had struggled with math suddenly felt curious. Artists used fractals in their designs. Programmers created fractal-based landscapes in video games and special effects. And scientists, they began to apply fractal and chaotic thinking to fields as wide-ranging as medicine, modeling, heart rhythms, and brain signals. Geology measuring earthquakes and mountain ranges. Computer science data compression and graphics. Astronomy studying the shape of galaxies and cosmic dust. Mandelbrot's vision had crossed boundaries again. But with success came challenges. As more people entered the world of fractals and chaos, misunderstandings also grew. Some treated fractals as magic. Others copied the visual beauty without understanding the math. There were critics who warned that too many people were playing with pretty pictures and forgetting the real science. Mandelbrot responded calmly. He had spent his entire career being questioned, and he understood the difference between fad and foundation. He was proud of the visual impact fractals had, but he never forgot their deep mathematical roots. He continued writing, lecturing, and researching. In every interview and talk, he reminded people, this is not just art. This is a new kind of geometry. At the same time, Mandelbrot continued to explore financial systems. He still believed that standard economic models were broken. Using fractal ideas, he tried to create better ways of understanding risk, crisis, and market movements. His work remained outside the mainstream, but time was on his side. As financial crashes struck in the 1980s and 1990s, more economists began to look at his ideas with fresh eyes. Personally, Mandelbrot remained a curious, restless mind. He never stayed in one academic department too long. He visited universities across the world, gave guest lectures, and worked with scientists from many fields. His voice was always polite, but firm. His ideas were always careful, but bold. Most of all, he kept returning to a central belief. The world is not as smooth as we once thought. Whether in nature, markets, or human behavior, complexity is real, and we need tools to understand it. Fractals and chaos theory were not just scientific tools, they were also a way of thinking, a way of accepting that irregularity and unpredictability were not failures, but part of the deep structure of reality. As Mandelbrot pushed forward, he was no longer working alone. A generation of scientists and artists had grown up inspired by his ideas. Students were now using software to explore Mandelbrot sets from home. Researchers were building new theories on top of his foundation. The once unwelcome guest of mathematics had become one of its most imaginative leaders. But even as Mandelbrot's work continued to influence others, he remained focused on the joy of discovery. In his own words, the most important instrument of thought is the eye. He wanted people to look more closely at the world, to see its roughness, its complexity, its hidden order, and he knew that this journey into the unknown between chaos and order was only just beginning. Chapter 8: Reflections, Recognition, and Return. By the early 2000s, Benoit Mandelbrot was recognized not just as a mathematician, but as a visionary, whose ideas had shaped the way people viewed the world. His once unconventional thoughts had inspired a wave of research and creative work across disciplines. Still, as Mandelbrot aged, he remained deeply reflective, returning often in his mind to the places, people, and puzzles that had guided his path. This was a time of recognition, but also of return. Although Mandelbrot had spent most of his life in the United States, he felt a deep connection to his European roots. He frequently traveled to France and maintained close ties with French mathematicians and scientists. In later years, he began to speak more openly about his early life, his family's escape from danger, the challenges of adapting to new cultures, and the support he had received from mentors and relatives. These stories gave context to his lifelong focus on irregularity, margins, and the unexpected beauty in what others might ignore. Professionally, he continued to publish even after retiring from his full-time position at IBM in the mid-1980s. In 2004, he joined the faculty at Yale University as a Sterling Professor, one of the university's highest academic honors. There, he found a new home for his ideas and a fresh audience of curious minds. Though no longer young, Mandelbrot's energy remained impressive. He gave lectures around the world, often using colorful slides of fractals to both teach and captivate. He was not interested in simply explaining formulas. He wanted people to see mathematics with their own eyes. During this period, the public fascination with fractals remained strong. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and even children's books introduced his ideas to new generations. The Mandelbrot set had become a symbol, not only of a particular mathematical concept, but of endless discovery. Yet behind this fame, Mandelbrot remained cautious. He worried that the beauty of fractals would be reduced to decoration, their mathematical depth forgotten. In his talks, he always emphasized that fractals were not just about pretty images, they revealed real patterns in nature, and they were based on solid reasoning. In 2004, Mandelbrot published his final major work, The Misbehavior of Markets, co-written with Richard L. Hudson. In it, he once again challenged the way people think about finance and risk. He criticized the traditional economic models that assumed markets were smooth and followed neat curves. Instead, he showed that markets behaved more like fractals, full of sharp edges, sudden jumps, and complex rhythms. The book was bold, timely, and controversial. Some economists rejected it, while others welcomed the challenge. For Mandelbrot, it was never about being popular. It was about telling the truth as he saw it, even if that meant going against long-held beliefs. Personally, Mandelbrot began to slow down. He spent more time with his family, especially his wife Aliette, who had supported him through every stage of his unusual career. They had shared a long, loving partnership, and their bond gave Mandelbrot great comfort. He also enjoyed watching how his ideas had spread into unexpected places, into medicine, where doctors used fractal analysis to study blood vessels and brainwaves, into architecture, where designers created buildings that echoed natural patterns, into environmental science, where researchers studied the fractal structure of forests and coastlines. In every case, Mandelbrot saw the same message reflected. Nature does not work with straight lines and perfect circles. It works with complexity. Looking back, Mandelbrot spoke often about the difficulty of his early years, the suspicion of his peers, the confusion of his students, the long fight to gain acceptance, but he also expressed deep pride in what he had achieved. He had created a new way of seeing and measuring the world, one that welcomed roughness, change, and surprise. In interviews, he often returned to one central idea. The most important discoveries are not about finding new answers, but asking new questions. That belief had shaped his career and changed mathematics forever. As he aged, Mandelbrot received numerous honors. He was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, received the Japan Prize, and was awarded honorary degrees from leading universities. But he remained modest. Awards were nice, he said, but they were not the point. The real reward was in the joy of discovering something new and sharing it with others. Though his health began to weaken in the late 2000s, Mandelbrot continued to write and reflect. He began preparing materials that would help future researchers continue his work. He also spent time mentoring young scientists, encouraging them to think broadly, take risks, and question assumptions. And always, he urged them to look at the world, not just equations, to ask themselves, what do I see? What pattern lies beneath this complexity? In these final years, Benoit Mandelbrot had truly come full circle, from a refugee child in Poland to a rebellious student in France, from a lone thinker at IBM to a celebrated figure of global science. His journey was marked not by straight lines, but by the very shapes he had studied, rough, irregular, endlessly surprising. Chapter 9. The Final Years and the Legacy of Roughness. As Benoit Mandelbrot entered the final chapter of his life, his body began to slow, but his mind remained as vivid and engaged as ever. He continued to write, think, and teach with the same restless curiosity that had defined him for decades. Even as he faced growing health challenges, he remained focused on one thing: the unfinished work of understanding complexity. In 2010, Mandelbrot was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was a harsh blow for the 85-year-old scientist who had spent his life unlocking the secrets of chaotic systems, sudden changes, and unpredictable patterns. Still, he responded to the news with grace and dignity. He was not afraid of death. He said he had lived fully and followed his own path, something few people could say. In his final months, Mandelbrot reflected deeply on the long arc of his life. He had traveled across countries, crossed disciplinary boundaries, and questioned scientific traditions. He had never tried to fit in, and in doing so, he had helped create something entirely new. One of his greatest joys during this time was seeing how widely his ideas had taken root. He received letters and messages from around the world. Students, artists, scientists, engineers, and even people with no formal training in math wrote to tell him how fractal geometry had changed how they saw the world. He was especially proud of the Mandelbrot set, which had become one of the most recognizable images in modern mathematics. Though simple in formula, it was deep in meaning. Its endlessly detailed boundary seemed to hold a universe within a dot, just as Mandelbrot himself had once imagined. As he grew weaker, Mandelbrot focused his remaining energy on ensuring that his work would outlive him. He worked closely with collaborators, archived his papers, and gave interviews that captured his insights and reflections. He wanted future generations to understand not just the results, but the questions that had led him there. He often repeated one message to young thinkers: don't be afraid of roughness. Don't be afraid of going your own way. On October 14, 2010, Benoit Mandelbrot passed away in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just days before his 86th birthday. The news of his death quickly spread across scientific and artistic communities. Obituaries appeared in major newspapers, and tributes poured in from mathematicians, physicists, artists, economists, and everyday people touched by his work. But Mandelbrot had already made peace with mortality. For him, death was simply another boundary, one he approached with the same sense of curiosity he had always brought to life. His passing marked the end of a remarkable journey, but it also began a new chapter in the legacy of his ideas. Today, Mandelbrot's influence continues to grow. In mathematics, fractal geometry is now a standard field of study. Universities offer entire courses based on his theories. Researchers use fractals to model everything from cloud formation to internet traffic. Fractal analysis plays a critical role in medical imaging, environmental monitoring, and artificial intelligence. In finance, Mandelbrot's ideas about market behavior are increasingly seen as visionary. While his rejection of the normal distribution was once controversial, many now agree that financial systems behave more like turbulent storms than smooth rivers. Risk managers and economists turn to his writings when designing more accurate models of economic instability. In art and media, the fractal aesthetic remains powerful. From CGI landscapes in films to generative music and visual design, the fingerprints of Mandelbrot's work are everywhere. Fractal-based patterns are used in computer games, virtual reality, and modern architecture. But beyond any single field, Mandelbrot's real gift was a way of thinking. He taught the world that complexity was not the enemy of science. It was its most exciting frontier. He showed that patterns could be found in chaos, and that beauty could emerge from mathematical precision. He helped people accept that the world is not neat, and that this mesensis is not a flaw, but a feature. More importantly, Mandelbrot's story inspires independence of thought. He followed no standard career path. He trusted intuition, images, and irregular data. He defied expectations and carved out his own space, often at great personal and professional risk. His journey reminds us that some of the most powerful ideas come from outsiders, from those who ask questions others are afraid to ask. And in that spirit, Mandelbrot remains a kind of guide, not just for mathematicians, but for anyone trying to make sense of a complex, ever-changing world. He didn't just map the fractal shapes of nature, he helped us see the fractal shape of life. Chapter 10. Fractals Forever. Mandelbrot's enduring influence in science and culture. One of Mandelbrot's most important contributions was giving scientists a new language and a toolkit for describing complex forms. Before fractal geometry, scientists often tried to simplify nature to smooth out the jaggedness of coastlines, clouds, or mountains. But Mandelbrot taught them to embrace the irregular, to see it not as noise or error, but as information. Today, this mindset influences physics in the study of turbulence, galaxies, and quantum systems. Fractal mathematics helps describe how energy and matter behave in unpredictable environments. Biology and medicine, the branching of blood vessels, the patterns of lung tissue, and the rhythms of the human heart all show fractal properties. Doctors now use fractal analysis to better detect diseases, especially in medical imaging. Environmental science. Scientists use fractals to model forests, river networks, climate systems, and even the distribution of animal populations. These tools help monitor environmental change with greater precision. Perhaps most importantly, Mandelbrot's work paved the way for data-driven thinking. In a world overflowing with information, his belief that patterns lie hidden within complexity has helped guide new fields like data science, machine learning, and network theory. Fractals in technology and innovation. Technology has brought Mandelbrot's ideas to life in astonishing ways. Computer graphics, once limited to simple shapes and textures, now use fractals to build realistic landscapes, clouds, fire, and more. Video games like Minecraft, No Man's Sky, and Fract OSCR built using fractal generation to create infinite, explorable worlds. Fractals also power advances in compression technology, allowing large images and videos to be stored more efficiently. In wireless communication, fractal antennas offer improved performance across multiple frequencies. In architecture and urban design, fractal principles help create buildings and spaces that mirror nature's forms, resulting in structures that feel both innovative and organically human. Even music has felt the touch of Mandelbrot. Composers experiment with fractal rhythms and patterns to create evolving, non-repetitive soundscapes that mirror the unpredictability of natural systems. Fractals in education and imagination. Beyond science and technology, Mandelbrot's work has made math more accessible and beautiful to learners of all ages. The visual nature of fractals, the repeating spirals, branching trees, and infinite zooms offers a powerful way to teach complex concepts. Students who once feared math are drawn in by the magic of the Mandelbrot set, exploring it through software and interactive simulations. Teachers use fractals to introduce ideas of scale, iteration, dimension, and self-similarity in a way that feels intuitive and exciting. Books, documentaries, and websites continue to celebrate Mandelbrot's life and work. His name appears not only in academic journals, but also in online art communities, science fiction, and popular culture. The deeper legacy, a philosophy of complexity, more than any individual formula or image. Mandelbrot left behind a way of seeing the world, a philosophy that embraces complexity instead of fearing it. In a time when so many aspects of life, economies, ecosystems, social networks feel unpredictable and unstable, Mandelbrot's ideas provide tools to understand rather than oversimplify. His insistence that roughness, irregularity, and sudden change are natural rather than unnatural helps us make peace with uncertainty. It encourages us to look for structure in the unexpected, and to trust that within the apparent chaos, meaning often waits. His work reminds us that beauty lies in detail, that small things matter, and that simple rules can create infinite results. An invitation to continue the journey. Benoit Mandelbrot never stopped asking questions, and perhaps that is his greatest legacy. He invited others to think differently, to challenge the smooth, and to celebrate the wild edges of knowledge. His life story shows that one person, driven by wonder and courage, can change the world, not by following rules, but by rewriting them. To learners of English, math, science, or art, Mandelbrot's legacy offers this lesson. Stay curious, explore deeply, don't be afraid of complexity. What seems rough and confusing at first may reveal surprising patterns. If you just look closely enough, the journey into the fractal universe has no final destination. There is always another layer to discover, another pattern to explore, another question to ask. And as long as we continue that journey, the spirit of Benoit Mandelbrot lives on in every line we draw, in every idea we challenge, and in every hidden pattern we dare to reveal. Fractals are forever. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.